Hello and welcome back to Let's Talk Real Estate. My name is Kristen Jock with Compass, and on this week's episode I wanted to speak about the recent rent reform that took place for stabilized buildings. So there was legislation that was expiring June 15th, and the legislature in Albany put together a plan to revise the rent laws governing rent stabilized buildings and units. So there's really three questions that I kind of wanted to go over that I'm hearing from a lot of people. So the first question is, what are the legislative changes that I think will have the greatest impact? So I think there's really three main things that will have a huge effect on the multifamily housing in New York City. And that involves major capital improvements, which take place when you upgrade systems within a building or replace a roof or replace windows. And that's been capped at 2%, and it was previously 6%. And those increases that are relayed onto the existing tenants in the building would then expire after 30 years. So the rent would go back to what the previous rent was before you did the improvement. The other item is individual apartment improvements. So you used to be able to renovate a stabilized building unit and increase the rent based on the amount of money that you put into the unit. And that's now been capped at $15,000 per every 15 years for each rent stabilized unit. And just to give you an idea, that would go as far as maybe renovating a bathroom. So much less an apartment that maybe hasn't been vacant in 15, 20 years and actually needs system upgrades like electrical and plumbing and things of that nature. So it's not enough to actually upkeep a building. But that's been capped at $15,000 for every 15 years. And also that expires after 30 years, so the rent then goes back down to what the legal rent was before the improvement. The third thing is the elimination of the vacancy bonus. So you used to be able to increase rent by 20% every time a tenant vacated a rent stabilized apartment. That's now been eliminated altogether. So those are the three things that I think will have the biggest impact based on the most recent legislation that was passed. So the second question is, what kind of effects do I think that will have on landlords? So I think that for rent stabilized multifamily properties, the value for those buildings will go down, probably almost immediately. In addition to that, the expenses for upkeeping buildings is going to continue to rise as it has, consistently historically, and that those expenses are going to outpace the rental income that you can make in a stabilized building, because all of those incentives to increase the rent and increase the value of the apartments have been eliminated. And lastly, it's going to put upward pressure on other free market units and buildings in the city. So free market units are going to increase in rent, and the building values are also going to increase in rent. So while the stabilized buildings have overregulation and are going to go down, it's going to put an upward pressure on all of the buildings and units that aren't regulated by stabilized housing. And the third question that I wanted to answer is, what can you do as a landlord, or what advice would I give you as a landlord of a stabilized building? So, there are those of the mindset that this legislation cannot continue to be, that there will eventually be a reform of the policies or a modification of the policies. So for those people that believe that they may reform it in 6 months or a year, you may decide that you want to just hold on to the building and wait and see what inevitably happens versus doing anything drastic like selling the property. But there are others who probably don't have hopes that will actually come to be. So they may decide that they'd like to sell and look at potentially alternative types of investments. So one thing that I would encourage those folks to do would be to sell their stabilized building and invest either in other stabilized buildings or in free market buildings within opportunity zones, because there are, and like I spoke about on last week's video, there are tax incentives that you can take advantage of, and if you hold for long enough, that'll be the capital gains will be tax-free for you. So that's another option. And then of course there are people who maybe purchased a stabilized building or will purchase a stabilized building in an opportunity zone, or just people who own stabilized buildings that will decide to hold on to them. And for those people, I would encourage smarter type of renovation and thinking when it comes to how to maintain your building. So certainly keeping in mind the kinds of materials that you're using, and trying to purchase materials that have a longer life expectancy, and also to input systems that have greater efficiency when it comes to the things that will be expenses for your building. So heating, cooling, water, and all of those types of things. So as usual, I hope this information is useful. I'm sure that people will have additional questions outside of these three that I've illustrated. So feel free to contact me. Feel free to leave your comments and questions below. Have a great week, and I will see you all soon.